I was leaned on a little on Friday night when Dr. Boston called me and asked me to fill in for him today. My first reaction was a little bit of anxiety. What would be a sermon topic that I could put together in 36 hours? Well, he suggested I might go ahead with a question box format, but I wasn't secure with that. I have never felt equipped to try to answer questions on the fly in front of 200 or 300 people. I just don't do that. I'm sure with his doctoral exam, he probably felt that he was open to the Inquisition and he would do it again, but not me. I would worry not only that my answers would be inadequate, but also that whatever I said would be boring, and I wouldn't like that to be imposed on me if I were in your place. So I decided that I would do more of what I usually do to find a sermon topic, which would be to refer to current events as a possibility and the calendar. But when I considered what current events have been lately, it seemed to me that we are overloaded with information about that, and you're not necessarily looking for my personal perspectives on elections and politics, especially since I'm not the minister serving right now. And as I see it, there's more than enough concern and stress going around every day this summer, especially after last week's performances every evening. So when I went to the calendar, my lifelong interest in both American and European history, which I've inflicted on many congregations over the years, and my perspectives on that come from that history consideration often suggest topics which at least fascinate me and which might be interesting to hear, maybe. First off, though, I wanted to acknowledge we are in Houston, and therefore today's date, July 21, has a strong association with the space program. As some of us remember, Neil Armstrong first left the Apollo 11 lander to set foot on the moon in the early morning hours with the words, "One small step for man." Some of us also remember it was 32 years later on the same date, July 21 of 2011, that the last space shuttle mission was successfully completed with the return of the Atlantis shuttle from the International Space Station, which is superannuated, which is to say old, and still orbiting the Earth today. But on a global scale, I found that 26 nations around the world celebrate national holidays in July. July 1st is Canada Day, some of us may know. July 4th, everybody knows, is Independence Day. And July 14, as I insisted on reminding you last week, was France's Bastille Day. But I was just reminded this weekend by someone who seemed to know that today is also the commemoration of the formation of the independent country of Belgium. And today I wore the colors of their flag, black, yellow, and green. Their stripes, they're vertical. But it turns out that there are folks celebrating by having waffles and Belgian frites right now while they're watching parades in Brussels and Liège and other towns in Belgium. The territory that we now recognize as the modern country, Belgium, was of course ruled by the French during the time of Napoleon because he ruled everything in Europe. But upon his defeat at Waterloo, which I think is in the Belgian territory, in 1815, the southern territory of French-speaking Catholics was consolidated with the northern Dutch speakers under the rule of the Dutch king, a Protestant. But that did not end the ambitions of the new French king, Charles I, to reclaim the Walloon region dominated by French speakers. But on the death of the French king, I think it's Charles I, during the fall of 1830, a coalition of dissident Belgians from both the northern and southern and eastern edges of Belgium led a brief war of separation and independence from the kings of both Netherlands and France. And so in short order, their military efforts were successful in the context of the long-term European instability created by the defeat of Napoleon. And over the next several months, those founding fathers who had won independence saw that they needed a symbolic unifier who would be accepted by the other rulers of Europe and would also rule in such a way that would guarantee collaboration and balance between the three dominant cultures of French, Dutch, or Flemish, and German ethnicities and actual languages. And so without an equivalent figure like our own George Washington, they could find nobody who seemed appropriate in Belgium. So in what may seem to us to be a strange initiative, they systematically recruited an English-speaking royal who was not beholden to any of the other three. And he happened to be an uncle of Queen Victoria. So at one time we know that all of Europe was ruled by either children or relatives of Queen Victoria. And in this case, he took the throne of the new constitutional monarchy of Belgium. So this day, July 21, is the annual celebration of the 1831 coronation of Leopold I, the first king of unified Belgium, who had been a prince of Saxe-Coburg. And so, in Belgium, it is clearly illustrated the process of independence from the ruling monarchs in France and Netherlands and other invaders required an recognition of a common interest, a unification under an agreed constitution with a culturally neutral monarch. And so it is clear that interdependence, an acknowledgement of how they needed each other, preceded their independence. For Americans, as we know, the process of getting independence was more complicated, but it involved the same sort of recognition. When we, of course, used our name, the United States of America, we are acknowledging that it was coined by the founding fathers of our country during the time of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution which followed. Our own founding fathers knew that each of the original colonies which were settled and formed by the British through various investment schemes had always seen themselves as states independent of others. And so only by mutual consent could those newly autonomous units, like corporations, be merged and united while remaining semi-autonomous. They could only hope that their merger would make them economically viable and politically and strategically strong enough to resist external forces, especially the forces of the mother country, the then recently created United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. That was an acknowledgement of unity precedes independence. And so any one of the several economic crises and half a dozen declared and undeclared wars over the ensuing 75 years, the 1812 war with Britain, the France war, with the wars with Mexico, with the pirates in the Mediterranean, and the various insurrections and other internal strife, which was followed by the Civil War to prove their interdependence, could have extinguished their so-called independence. The affirmation of the Union itself in the Civil War was a profound example of that essential truth. And so as we think about it, the adjective united thereby reflected the interdependence of their otherwise weaker and historically and potentially permanently warring neighbors with each other. To change the direction of this talk just a little bit, many years ago when I was an undergraduate at the Institute on Main Street, which is now recognized as a university, I skipped the intro course on economics, which I thought would be boring, in favor of a more attractive course for a globalist like me called International Economics. It was taught by a young and enthusiastic professor named Gordon Smith. And as I recall, we got a full dose of Keynesian theories and many graphic illustrations of how price and demand curves must intersect or nothing would happen. Along with those theories, though, we had extensive readings on how free trade could allow for comparative advantage, in which, in theory, could work to maximize mutual benefits across national and regional borders. Briefly, not to take it on a dissertation, those regions and nations which have natural resources like Texas oil, or water, or climate, or fertile soils, or other minerals, or, as in South Africa, diamonds, should be able to leverage those resources by open market exchange with nations which have a surplus of other productive resources or investments in manufacturing, and those nations with surplus population resources. They should cross across borders, and so everybody gets the best of what's available. But of course, human capital in under-resourced but overpopulated areas is extremely cheap. And so, in one easy example, we were shown in that class how the movement of manufacturing from mills in Britain to the young northeastern United States, later to Japan, China, Mexico, India, Thailand, wherever, during the industrial and post-industrial periods was both necessary and ultimately beneficial process for all those participating over the past 200 years, as long as everybody is treated fairly. But in both the 19th and early 20th century, according to my professor, whenever new forms of protectionism or embargoes or other barriers to free trade become excessive, worldwide economic dislocations were bound to ensue, often resulting in deep recession, depression, and sometimes wars. This appears to have happened at least once or twice in each successive generation over the past 2 centuries, as the ruling classes of certain nations seem to forget the reality of economic consequences of what are essentially politically or strategically motivated acts of protectionism over and over again. And so, aside from the punitive actions or defensible national security considerations, which have been evident in our actions against Russia, recent administrations of border states, like, for example, Texas, have insisted on threatening or imposing restrictions on immigration or border restrictions with tariffs and other protectionism, which often undermine the many mutual arrangements built on the premise of maximizing benefits to all. That does not mean that all trade restrictions should be abolished. It means that they should be considered carefully as to their consequences for all nations. So now we are confronted with the ultimate reality that our interdependent worldwide economic and political systems are fragile and can be permanently damaged or destroyed by lack of foresight. I want to close with the discussion about the insight that brings to me from the recent online General Assembly for the Unitarian Universalist Association, where the proposed amendments to their bylaws in Article 2 were adopted only after vigorous debate for several years. The underlying rationale would be that there needs to be regular affirmation of our engagement as both interdependent and semi-autonomous, because we are voluntarily associating with other congregations across the world. And so I use that adjective semi-autonomous intentionally because we always need to remind ourselves to acknowledge that we have mutual agreements on shared principles, purposes, priorities, and now values about life in general and our lives as Unitarian Universalists. In our congregational polity, theoretically, we can put up all the boundaries and barriers we want to interchange of programs, ministers, and members. But especially in this fluid society, things happen which demand quicker and more coordinated responses for which we can rely on each other. We can lean on other congregations. We can lean on our association. And we know life and institutional life can be short. There are only so many ways that we can invent to do things, so many costs to bear in recreating, operating, and repairing all the systems we need over and over again. And just in the past 8 years, as Americans and as Unitarian Universalists, We have seen responses to threats to our shared ideals about how to lead, how to follow. And some of those come from our own Unitarian Universalist sisters and brothers and cousins. Responses to world events like the terrible tragedy of October 7 in Israel and the response of Israel to the Palestinians. We have seen how different perspectives must be resolved over time, and some of that is outside of anyone's control. And now we also see a continuing debate about border policies and immigrant families and how those should be dealt with. And there are good Unitarian Universalists on both sides of every argument, unlike in Charlottesville. I believe that Unitarian Universalist activists were present at most of the demonstrations in both sides. And in these public arenas and in flaming wars on the internet, we share our values, our impatient idealism, our insistence that the life consciousness we share in our brief time on this one earth must matter. Our insistence that we are part of an interdependent network of all existence. I saw a graphic illustration of that with a little short movie that my granddaughter and I watched in the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences just on Friday. It was called From Quarks to Quasars, and it showed how the actual structure of the universe is one dynamic oscillation and a completely perfect balance of so many different physical laws that are way beyond our comprehension in our daily lives. But what are the implications for us on this human scale about our own sense of shared identity? I think the new icon or the symbol of our shared values, which is centered with the word love, as you go around the circle of the various values, and I think they're altogether 7, on the top is the word interdependence. And I think it is moved from the 7th principle, acknowledging the interdependence of all existence, to our top principle, the recognizing how whatever we do, whatever we say, it affects others. And it continues to affect what happens in our shared world, where all of us must coexist for mutual regard, mutual benefit, and hopefully for mutual elevation to our highest consciousness of what life can be for everyone. Thank you for your attention this morning.